Friday. So hello, everybody. Hello. We are having our conversation, our weekly privacy chat, talking about some of the hottest topics of the day for people who care about figuring out how to do it right on Thursday. So I'm glad that many of you are joining us today, or if you're catching the stream later, you will see that I am joined by Ian Cohen, the CEO of Locker. And I wanted to have Ian on for a couple of reasons. As many of you know, there is a deadline in several days from today. Who knows what it is? Post it in the comments. We'll send you a pair of iHeart Privacy socks, or I'll give you a hug if I see you at IPP, whichever you prefer. What deadline is stressing out people in the privacy compliance world in just a couple of days? Yes, you know what it is. And it's not the only state with a new deadline coming up pretty soon around sensitive data. Many of you are also being sued for wiretapping lawsuits because of cookies and pixels. You're being beat up over VPPA compliance. You're tearing your head out because cookies and pixels are everywhere. Your business and product people say you must have them, and it's all come to a head. So Ian and the team at Locker have a report coming out on Monday. We're going to give you a little bit of a preview. But before we get into the report, which will come out on Monday, let me chat with Ian first a little bit about, I described, I thought, this uncomfortable situation that exists today for people in legal, engineering, compliance, who are trying to do the right thing, but advertising or analytics are part of every organization, whether it's the government or a school or companies, reality today. And it seems like the pressure, the legal risks, the compliance risks are higher than ever. I named the SIPA lawsuits. I named the Washington and other sort of sensitive data pieces. What are the other stress things that you are sort of seeing as that are really driving the tensions right now?
I think you covered at a high level. You have websites are built using third-party software, and that's just inherent in the architecture of how we build websites. So you're going to build a website using form software, using good, companies like Salesforce and Datadog and all kinds of different pieces of software, and they're all third-party. On top of that, you're going to use marketing technologies. And you mentioned SIPA and the wiretapping lawsuits based on what, 5-10 years ago was considered standard MarTech. So the standard tools we've been using for a long time are running smack into a Rube Goldberg device of legislation and enforcement actions. And it's just a very, very complex ecosystem. And so we're trying to cut through that and make it very clear to a company what's actually going on their site at a specific level. So I think the Washington My Health, My Data Act is top of mind for everybody. The wiretapping lawsuits continue. You have Nevada coming online. But I think that the overarching biggest issue is we just don't have clear one set of rules we can follow. There's no clear federal guidance. And even if it came out now, it wouldn't supersede the states. So we're stuck with this patchwork of laws, and the states, I know, are trying hard to work together to give clear guidance to companies. But in the meantime, we have to, navigate this maze.
You said something that I want to emphasize, and that I realize I probably don't make clear enough in some of our communications. Pixels, cookies are sort of the, quote unquote, high level, third party, most visible and obvious stuff. But you flagged the importance of third parties as part of kind of a public website app infrastructure. And I guess the big sea change in the US in the last couple of years is that what is a third party, has been sliced and diced much more carefully, sometimes well, and sometimes in an awkward way. We used to assume that if you had a vendor, they were a third party, and then other people were buying or selling. But we've got these very specific laws now that say everyone is a quote unquote third party, meaning it might be a sale or a giveaway of your data, unless you have exact language in your contract, and maybe even in terms of some recent enforcements, not only language, but processes to audit and ensure that those parties are not using your data other than the very specific ways that each state law covers. So you mentioned a couple of vendors, but I want to dwell, because I think a lot of people are very hyper focused on the cookie because they think it's only about behavioral advertising and tracking. But the laws go far further than that and make a whole class of companies who may be doing very legitimate stuff, right?
Yeah.
And some maybe have entire business models you don't know about based on the legitimate stuff that might, in their mind, not qualify for a sale, but in your mind, might put you at legal risk. Can you say a bit more about that?
I mean, absolutely. So let's start with, most companies are well-intentioned, and those are the folks we're talking about. And so let's just start from the vantage point that you have a company that's extremely well-intentioned to the point that they don't want anybody collecting any data on their site. You've got third-party vendors, and they use other third parties. So the issue is cloud software in general and how it's served up. So the issue we've run into is there's been a lot of time spent on, what do you do with data that you're holding on your servers? There's been a lot of time spent with security and web application firewalls. But what about the data you collect and share in the first place? So this ecosystem grows exponentially large because you might be using one vendor, they're in turn using another vendor, they're in turn using another vendor. And so if we actually visualize the web page of most websites, even healthcare websites, it usually shocks people to see all the different third parties on that page. By third parties, I don't just mean the third party software you're using. I mean the third party ad tech. And that ad tech has their own ecosystem of people they share data with. So what I'm really getting at is you can intend to do the right thing and you can plug in trusted third parties, and you still have this vast area that you have to monitor that's not easily visible to most companies.
You're going to be very busy in the next couple of years in a whole nother area. And I think the Biden executive order, which maps out whether or not your data goes to vendors who have vendors who have vendors who have vendors who might be a minority controlled by a Chinese company vendor. And so there's a whole host, there's a whole host of additional pain points, national security oriented. We're seeing a lot of companies taking a look at the Biden EO and saying, well, I get that I shouldn't be selling bulk data to, the Chinese Communist Party, let alone, maybe location data. But I don't know whether my vendors have vendors who are 30% or 50% owned by a Chinese company. And so I gotta imagine, and obviously so how can I go down the full chain? I guess when you described your mapping, you're at least following everything you can see, not just from interacting at the web. You guys interact behind the firewall in a way that give me a little bit more of a flavor of how this can be helpful.
Sure. If I go to a site, I think the issue, let's go to the Biden order. Don't send data. I think it's to Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, to name a few, right? And everybody says, of course, I'll never do that. There's a very plain issue and then a more complex issue. The plain issue is 2% of companies are sending data to Russia and China. And we're not talking about small companies. And that might not sound like a big number, but 2% times the tens of millions of companies we have in the country is a big number. So that's directly sharing data with Russia and China, not intentionally. Some ad tech system down the line is sharing that data, and the company's probably unaware. The second issue is just vendors. Like let's take TikTok, for example. The House just passed, a bill that may or may not pass, and if it does pass, it will face legal challenges for sure. But you've got vendors that, like TikTok, that frankly just should not be on certain kinds of web pages. You should not have a TikTok banner, at least in my opinion, on a page where you go and look up a medical symptom. right? Or treatment for cancer, addiction, or what have you. So it's easier said than done, is my point. And, we've pulled out in our report that 2% of the companies that we looked at about 4,000 different companies in 4 different sectors. And we came up with a whole bunch of analytics. 2% of them were sending data to Russia or China. Behind that, we saw a bunch that were sending data to Belarus or, a bunch of other places. And I guess the first principle, way to handle this is, okay, well, wait a minute. What is your business? If you're a business in the United States and you're treating, patients, say you're a hospital, there's probably no reason for you to be sending data to any of those places. I don't think you're trying to offer treatment to somebody in Belarus or China or Russia. If you are, that's great. And you have every right to be, fielding that data. But yeah, in short, easier said than done. So we map everything. We see where the data is coming from, which countries it's coming from, which vendors it's coming from, what data it's gathering, whether that data is sensitive. And the word sensitive data, as we all know, changes a lot these days. So on the geo front, I think it's just somewhat out of control right now. And I don't think it's an easy problem for companies to solve without the right technology.
Years ago, when I first implemented a sort of a version of a very rudimentary tool, I had to pay for it out of my integrity assurance budget. That's what our group was called. But I soon found that by identifying some of these third parties, some who were actually charging us money, or we were making commissions, or paying, a legitimate partner a commission for stuff that was then going to parties who we had no interest in being in business with, the business ended up kind of saying, wait, they cracked down on those vendors and, saved, a significant amount of money. And from my perspective, took it off my budget. They were more than happy to pay the fee, because they realized that they were actually saving money, and it wasn't just kind of my privacy compliance that was driving the agenda. So
right.
Speaking of privacy compliance, the answer we're seeing, a lot of our stakeholders are the chief privacy officers of the world. And so what they're begging, insisting, requiring is, unfortunately, cookie banners, consent banners, opt in, opt out. And I guess they're doing it sometimes to try to comply with European data protection law and get consent that might be needed to, set, collect an identifier, comply with e-privacy. Fine. Some of them, I guess, are doing it because of these wiretapping SIPA lawsuits, where they think they're perhaps getting the consent that might be needed, maybe successfully, maybe not. Some of them are doing an opt-out because they just can't deal with their business losing the analytics or the ad traffic. And they know that it's not maybe technically an opt-in consent on the wiretapping, but maybe they've improved their posture. They won't be the first to be sued, and so on and so forth. Is this, and then some are doing it to try to comply with these opt-ins or opt-outs for sensitive data under Washington Health Act or others. That's the answer, by the way, for folks to the deadline that's kicking in very shortly. Is that working? I mean, it's annoying users. It's popping up everywhere. People are like, I'm not in Europe. Why am I getting one of these? Yeah. Is it working? And how ubiquitous? It seems like it's everywhere. Your study, which is out Tuesday, not Monday, I'm told, is going to took a look at how prevalent this is. How prevalent is it? And is it effective?
All right. I'll answer both those questions. But first, yes, they annoy everybody. They annoy the marketing team at a company. They generally annoy the consumer. But let's just go to how many are using them and how effective is it. So 67% of companies have a banner of some sort, whether it's opt-in or opt-out. And it's usually an opt-out. Of those, I could go through the sectors. 88% of the S&P 500 now has some sort of banner. 59% of healthcare companies have some sort of banner. I'm looking up at 63% of financial services companies have it. But here's the kicker. 98% of all these companies drop third parties before the banner shows up. Okay. And you mentioned cookies. Cookies are really just one part. Cookies are just containers, pixels, trackers. And I think everybody listening here understands that when we say cookies, most people mean everything that grabs data. but it's not just cookies. And so the point is, if you're dropping all this stuff before the consent banner is even offered to you, it's in your browser. It's tracking you. It's not like there's a magical technology that can go and pull it out of your local storage. So that's part one. Part two is what's happening in this ecosystem. Let's just say you have a web page, and I'm not exaggerating here. You might have 200-300 different dependencies on that page. So your site might have 13 pieces of software it uses. Those 13 expand into more, and you end up with just a very large surface area. So that changes constantly. Like the web, the actual JavaScript that drives most of the privacy issues in the background changes constantly. So the result is, one, a bunch of stuff's dropping before the consent banner is given. Two, the consent banner, unless you're scanning the stuff in real time or every day, or you have a team of web developers on it, it's either missing trackers, pixels, beacons, cookies altogether. It's not classifying them correctly, or it's just not being effective. It's not working. Somebody hits reject all, and we still see data getting dropped, collected, and stored. So, I mean, I think I applaud trying to do the right thing. But even if all that worked, even if the third-party consent platforms work perfectly, because what they're trying to do, it's not an easy thing to do the way they're doing it. Even if they work perfectly, to your earlier point, does that, if I click accept all, does that protect me from HIPAA? So if I get sued because a patient said you shared that I have cancer with Facebook, and I come back as the company and say, yeah, but they hit accept all, it's meaningless. It's not considered informed consent. So step in the right direction. I would never put down something that's good for privacy, giving people choice. And an opt-in is a whole different ballgame, but we'll get there in a minute. But just to reiterate, 67% of companies have some banner. 98% of all companies that have the banner drop trackers before the banner is served, or there's a choice of interaction with the banner. And even when it is served and used, you still have a litany of problems. And even if you didn't have those problems, you've got a more pressing issue with the Video Privacy Protection Act, the wiretapping laws under the California Invasion of Privacy Act, and the list goes on and on and on. So it's not easy to do the right thing. And, you know, it's really difficult, particularly when the largest companies out there, like, you know, Google and Amazon, don't need any third-party data, don't need to collect any of this because they have first-party relationships. So I'm going a little far afield of your original question. I guess I would summarize it in saying there's stuff, it's not adequate. You need more.
Well, since you mentioned the big players and the big first parties, obviously one of the sea changes coming along, and I do want to come back to the report, but one of the big changes coming along that the platforms are driving, Apple with its ATT, opt-in consent, and its privacy manifest, and its nutrition labels, and now it's SK Ed Network, which is not an ed network, although maybe it'll be one day, but is Apple's mechanism for providing some reporting information in a sort of de-identified way. Obviously, the Google Sandbox proposals are efforts to require on-device, anonymized technical processing that will try to support some of the current utility of ad tech. Some goes away. Will this solve? Let's assume competition regulators are not a barrier to Google moving forward, or
Sure.
We already see some of their cookies being deprecated. Does the world of platform advertising solve the problem? If I'm just dealing with sort of these future sandbox models, is that going to eliminate the risk here?
No, I mean, they're good. Like the Apple's Private Relay is great, and the Chrome Privacy Sandbox is a step in the right direction. So kudos on all that. But I guess look at it from two perspectives. One is the overall effectiveness. Two is the role of the chief privacy officer at a company. So the overall effectiveness, it will make ad tech have to change, but that's a pretty big business, and it's not just going to flip over and die because of it, right? There are other ways to track people. But I think that the bigger issue for most companies is if you can ensure that everybody's using an Apple device, and Apple devices tend to be used by more affluent people, just statistically, if you can guarantee everybody's using an Apple device with private relay turned on and everybody's using Chrome Privacy Sandbox, great. If you could mandate that I'm only going to serve to Chrome Privacy Sandbox, there's a set of problems that you will have eliminated. You can't assume that as a company. The burden is so clearly now, the complexity of everything we're talking about, if I just take a step back for a second, anybody who works in this field knows how complicated the architecture on the web is when you're trying to make it private, because it wasn't built for privacy. It was built for search engines to find things. And now all of a sudden we're saying, no, we want to make it private, which is what I'm in the business of, and you are too. It's very difficult to do that, and the burden's falling on the companies necessarily because it's too complex for an end user to manage. So I love that these products are coming out. I think what Apple's doing is great. I think the Chrome Privacy Sandbox is a step in the right direction and a smart business decision for Google, but it doesn't solve the problem one iota, because you can't stand up in court and go, well, I just assume everybody uses Chrome Privacy Sandbox.
I think you're right in that, even if Google is successful at rolling it out, and it clearly is going to live by the sandbox rules. So if I buy on Google, and obviously Meta is forced to deeply sort of deal with how it advertises, and so the sandbox is going to be super relevant. But clearly, both for competitive reasons and just the reality, alternative IDs, unified IDs, we may yet look back at the cookie as the most anonymous friendly thing, when the next generation of IDs that may be more permanent, might have more privacy rules around them, but are probably going to be more personal, going to be working off, hash versions of your email or that sort of thing,
right.
Drive forward. And so today, maybe I can argue that a cookie or a pixel on a particular website, maybe I've done something to try to ensure it's not personal, probably lost cause given all the state laws. But here, I'm going to be allowing the third party to set sort of a industry standard unified ID. Very hard for anyone to argue that, it isn't going to be a personal identifier. You mentioned TikTok, and I'm looking at the report or the summary of a couple of the high level conclusions. And given the risk of TikTok, 12% of all scanned sites had a TikTok pixel, including 4.4% of healthcare sites. So that's a little bit concerning. It's not a huge number, but we do see the high risk. Healthcare is the target of a lot of these regulatory changes, whether it's women's care and reproductive freedom and the assault that's sort of under, and the goal of the administration and advocates and hopefully other reasonable companies to make sure that they're not putting people at risk with that data. It's very hard today to understand exactly what is or isn't HIPAA covered. The guidance is really a little bit confusing, right? I was just reading some of the Office of Civil Rights, HHS sort of guidance. And, if I'm a person looking for medical information on a website and I signed in somehow, and the website is a hospital or so forth, I'm captured by HIPAA. If I'm a student doing research, I'm not, but it's not clear how the website would have any clue whether or not, like, you don't yet read minds. So super high risk. Were you surprised by the TikTok numbers? Health 4.4, S&P 500 8.7. I mean, obviously people are advertising on TikTok, so they want information about whether their ads are working.
I wasn't surprised. I think a lot of people will be surprised. I mean, you brought up the OCR. Like, I mean, with all due respect, the guidance was not particularly helpful. And what are you practically going to do with that? If you run a healthcare website, you're not going to try to invent the smartest algorithm in the world to deduce whether somebody's a student or might be a patient, or is a student and a patient. So you just end up taking broad actions, and that's the real effect of this. So 12% of the sites having TikTok was not a surprise to me, because 33% of healthcare websites still have the Metapixel on their website, probably unknowingly, even though we've seen the last year of lawsuit after lawsuit based on the Metapixel. And I'm also not surprised, because a lot of times people will use broad social media tools, that add the social media trackers to the site. So it's very hard to make sure things do not end up on your site. Very easy to inadvertently end up with all these trackers on your site. So I was not surprised. I think when we show healthcare companies what's actually on their site, they're generally pretty surprised. So if you go across a column and look at how many sites have TikTok, Meta, and keep going across all the social media trackers, the numbers get pretty high.
The other really compelling data point in the report, which I think is going to get a lot of attention on Tuesday, and I understand you don't name names, but I do urge companies to be aware that the awareness that 98.5% of websites load cookies upon page load.
Correct.
37 cookies typically therefore set before the consent banner appears. So I know some people think they're getting it right by distinguishing whether it's an essential cookie or a cookie that's going to create more concern. But it sounds like there's a bit of a hole in that if you're really trying to be conservative and show a banner before any troubling third-party action is set, that's not being achieved as well as many people think it is.
No, I think people were able to ignore it when we had just CCPA. Sorry, the CCPA is enforced by the CPPA and modified by the CPRA. But I think it was tolerable when it was an opt-out. I think where we're moving now with sensitive data requiring an opt-in, it's not tolerable. But I think more to the point is that it's somewhat deceptive, not in a malicious way, but it is somewhat deceptive that if there's a cookie banner and a bunch of stuff's already been dropped on my site, and some of it is strictly necessary, a lot of it isn't. If that's happening, I don't think that's meeting just the general definition of what you would reasonably expect a user to think is happening on the website.
So how does Locker fit in? I think our audience knows, what cookie banners are and what the typical kind of consent management type, pop-ups and processes are. How are you different? Where does Locker fit into this?
Yeah, we're all data pros. So we attack the underlying technology issue with what's happening in the third-party ecosystem called the client side. So technically we call ourselves a client-side firewall. Practically what we do is we make everything visible on the site. So whatever you're using, we structure that and show you, here's everything running on your site. We show what page it's coming from, IP address, country. That's step one. Step two is we run it against pattern recognition to find risk signatures. So are you violating the VPPA, or could you be accused of it? Are you sending data to Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, or any other country you're not supposed to? Are you sending, what type of data? Is it a social security number? Is it private health information? And we run that through data loss prevention. So we make everything visible. We categorize it and show you the specific risk and why it's there. Not just here's a risk, but here's a risk and here's the exact page it's on and here's exactly what's causing it. If you want to go fix it, go fix it. The third part is you hit a button and we're able to block all these items for you. So your site, you might say simply, here's what I want to allow. Here's what I don't want to allow. And for the ones I do allow, I don't want the data going to certain regions and countries. And except for the sites I trust, I don't want any of them getting private health information or bank statements or anything else. We do all that. So we basically come in and make sure that on the page load and forward, your site meets the requirements of the policies it needs to enforce. And
So if I already have
online is-
if I already have a CMP, you would coexist with that and help me.
Yeah.
I now have information. Hey, go back and add these things or fix these things. Or if I don't have one, do you also provide? I now want to solve the problems you showed me that I have. Do you also provide that solution, or how do you work? How do you work in that space?
Yeah, so we exist alongside. We're totally different than consent management, but we can cover that for you if you like. Generally speaking, what happens is we're coming into large companies and saying, here are your policies that you want to enforce across all your domains, hundreds of domains, and we do that. If a company does not have any, and we validate if your consent manager is working and tell you where it is. So go ahead and use the consent manager. We're not trying to be a consent manager. That being said, yeah, we can put up a banner for you and handle that too. But that's a feature. That's not the core of what we do. We're trying to simply stop unauthorized data collection on the web. Full stop. Like that's it. And we try to bring it back to first principles. Obviously, it's up to the company whether or not they want to set strict rules or less than strict rules. But I'll tell you this. The main goal is on day one, just lower the surface area. If you've got 300 third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties existing on your site, lower it to the number that you actually need that actually are advantageous to you or marketing and whoever else. So
our friend Emily Barwell, one of the great European data protection lawyers who is here in the US, helping really be a bridge, flags what you've identified a kind of a problem that legal policy people are, hey, I need a solution, opt-in banner. And somehow the engineers who are, okay, I'll get you, we'll do your implementation, are implementing in a way that is not solving the legal problem.
Yeah.
Do they not understand the legal problem, or do the legal people not understand that the technology is, where's there a gap here? Why do we have this gap?
Well, you're an authority on this. I'd say it's both directions. I'd say there's technology legal doesn't understand, and legal the tech doesn't understand. So, like we created a simple dashboard so you can just see, is this or is this not happening? Is it still violating the VPPA or not? I mean, because that's really the core question. I think. And, chief privacy officers at different companies have different experiences. I think in general, there's a fairly big misunderstanding on who owns what, right? So the attorney or the GC, is asking for X, Y, and Z to happen. It gets executed through what web operations team or whoever's in charge of tag management, oftentimes marketing. And somewhere off to the side is the CTO and the CTO's team. So you've got this diffuse set of responsibility, and you need to be able to communicate to all of them effectively. You need to be able to say, this is the VPPA rule. These are the policies. And over here, and these are the actual technical reasons that you are compliant or not compliant. And there's a binary answer. You're either doing it or you're not doing it. And really tackling that problem is we attempt to do that. I think we do a pretty good job of it, but doing that is the core problem.
My old friend Michelle Dennedy, wise woman of privacy, wise woman of privacy engineering, and inspiring person all around, says it is not a gap. It is a gulf, and she spent her career trying to bridge that gap, and it sounds like it's maybe a gulf, an ocean, a lake. I don't know what we want to call it, but maybe even a volcano, but
chasm.
A chasm. Delighted to learn more about a software and in business that is seeking to bridge that gap by helping wise us all up. I look forward to the report. We'll reshare it when it comes out. Reach out, of course, to our friends at Lockr if you want to dive a bit deeper into the challenges and how they solve it. And a note on the FPF side, quiet this down. A note on the FPF side, our EdTech training, we've got to make sure we're not too cookies and pixels only focused. We got to make sure that we are educating people about the other key third parties that are creating liability. Thank you all for joining us. Great to see you. Delighted to see the great work Lockr has been doing, and look forward to seeing you and a lot of our audience at IAPP next week.
Yeah, thanks, Jules. Great to see you. See you next week in DC.
Thanks all.
Thank you.